Thank you. I'm glad to be here, glad to be spending the next hour, 15 minutes or so kind of looking at this. And actually we're looking at a topic that is fairly new for me. So this is really the first time I've been doing this. It's a new presentation, which is always a mixed blessing for you. Okay, and for me I suppose too, but it's so you're getting it at first run through, in the sense of I'm putting it together. Okay, so the good news, however, is that I have a pen in hand, and will be, so any comments you make, I'll be happy to use in my next time I present it, with obviously giving the proper citations. Here's my thesis for tonight. Okay, that a helpful way to look at the formative dynamics of parish or congregation is to examine it through the lens of community of practice. And that with that comes kind of an increasing awareness of ourselves as active participants in the Christian communities. In other words, part of understanding the church, and I'm going to basically propose that a given parish, for example, is really a community of communities of practice. Okay. That means then that we become much more aware of ourselves as practitioners of Christianity, Christians, okay? And that therefore that would enhance our ability to engage in and to meet the challenge of the mission of the church, to evangelize, to be proclaimers of the gospel. And so I want to look at this notion of community of practice and see how helpful it is for doing this. Now, first of all, kind of get us started, I want to be thinking about real experiences here, and I have a new toy. There we go. And I want to look at the notion of the life at St. Oda the Good. Okay, imaginary parish. Think of your own parish. It might be helpful as well. And think of all the groups that gather in your parish. Okay. You have catechists, RCIA team, Eucharistic ministers, pastoral staff, social justice committee, parish council, the Tuesday morning Bible study. And that's just like at first glance. Those are the groups that gather at some point, at some level, with greater or lesser consistency, greater or lesser commitment, but those are the ones that gather. Now, each of these groups engage in various activities that contribute to fulfilling the group's goal or task. Okay? But the fact is that if you were to watch the parish council, well, not our parish, no, you could watch our parish, no, it's fine, really, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. If you were to look in on the parish council, and you were to look in on the meeting of the RCIA team, they are doing many of the same activities. For a different reason, perhaps, in service to a different aim or a different goal, but they're doing some of the same activities, okay? Hopefully, one of the things they're doing is they're praying. They're talking, discussing, debating, arguing, gossiping, okay? Really. They're talking about their faith. They're keeping track of decisions that they're making, whether it's a kind of an informal understanding or somebody's actually taking notes. Somebody's keeping track of, we talked about this already, we decided that, okay? They're accomplishing set tasks. They're talking about the parish. They're doing remember when, okay, and probably they're having coffee, okay, and that's what these groups do. And what I want to argue is that each of these is or can be, isn't necessarily, but is or can be a community of practice. Okay, now what do I mean by community of practice? We want to look at the definition of community of practice. This is a hybrid of a definition from some reading that I'll do, that I'll give you the citation for in a minute, as well as my own thinking on this, okay? So a community of practice is a sustained gathering of people, okay, sustained, that means it's not just like the people on the bus. That's not a community of practice, okay, some kind of sustained. Sustained gathering of people whose interactions are marked by mutual engagement, shared enterprise, and common repertoire, common groups of activities that they do, where the collective learning involved in surviving or thriving as a community, in fulfilling itself as a community, leads to practices that enhance group identity and further group goals. Okay? That's kind of going to be our working definition of a community of practice. Okay? What could this look like? Let's think about the RCIA process in any parish. Okay? You know who's involved in that. Okay? You've got the director and the catechists and the sponsors and the support people and the liturgist. Okay? All right? And they meet fairly regularly. They certainly meet several times before the before the year begins, or however long a period is, to talk about what they want to do, to articulate for themselves what their goal is. And they might be able to kind of say something like that they're about the goal, or about the enterprise, kind of bigger than goal. They're about the enterprise, okay, of inviting people to participate in the life of the church in order to support them in their decision-making about their membership. Okay, they could say something like that. Okay, and they then engage in a whole variety of activities, a repertoire, that in fact serves that enterprise. Okay, so we want to think then about this, the RCIA at St. Odo the Good. Okay. What are some of the things they do? Well, they reflect on Scripture, they ask questions and pose responses, they experience rituals, they maintain the wisdom of the group, they establish traditions, they adjust to changing circumstances, they foster a balance between memory and openness, they celebrate with a larger parish community. Okay? Those are things that they do. Okay? And what I'm going to argue is that these activities are part of what are part of the expression of the RCIA this RCIA process as a community of practice. Making sense so far? Okay. I'm a little more tied to my notes than I usually am just because it's new. What am I supposed to say next? Okay, so, and in addition to that, what I would propose is that all of those items that I mentioned earlier are also communities of practice. So the catechist gathering, the parish council, etc., those are all. So when we think about St. Odo the Good, that's St. Odo the Good, okay, we recognize that it's a community of communities of practice. And that's the central focus of what we want to be looking at today is what does it mean to say that St. Odo the Good, our parish communities, the parish communities in which we live and work, that they are in fact themselves communities of practice. So this is what we're going to be doing then this evening. I'm going to do three things. One is give a brief account of what I mean by community of practice, drawing on the literature from education and business primarily. Examine the potential of thinking about each parish as a community of communities. Okay, what's the implication of that? What are some of the things we can draw from that? And then to draw out some of the implications of this for how we think about faith formation. Okay, so how could this be helpful in naming what we think we're doing when we're engaged in lifelong parish-wide religious education or catechesis? That is, how we think about the dynamics of growing faith. Okay, so that's where we're going today. Okay. Then let me just mention these two references. These are the primary texts that I'm using. Now, let me just tell you, don't buy them. Okay? I mean, they're just, honestly, this is a chapter in the book that I'm working on right now. You just have to wait for the book to come out. Only because these are very technical, and the first one particularly goes on and on and on. It's quite long, and right, it goes on and on and on. My students had to read the text for class, so they know it went on and on and on. But nonetheless, just because I'm an academician, I need to let you know where I get my ideas from, and those are the references that I'm drawing from. Okay. Okay. Now let's return again to that notion of community of practice and the definition that we had up there before, because I want to highlight three core ideas. I want to look at that notion of mutual engagement, shared enterprise, and common repertoire. I'm going to say that those three elements are the elements that we're going to highlight as a way to analyze and understand the communities that we're looking at. Okay, so that those, we're going to define those three elements and then look at a couple of examples. Okay, so we all have a sense of that. Okay, so the first one is mutual engagement. Okay, the fact of the matter is, communities never develop in theory. They always develop around some kind of enterprise or some kind of mutual engagement, some way of interacting with one another. So that part of it, behind a community of practice, is a willingness to gather and be engaged in service to a shared enterprise, kind of the group's goal and the group identity. Okay, so that it's a sense of that mutual engagement. Now, that mutual engagement is based on a common understanding of the competencies of the various members. In other words, part of how a community of practice works is that we are, in fact, committed to recognizing that other people in that community have competencies. And there's two different kinds of communities that Wenger talks about. One is complementary. Okay, so if you think about the RCIA team, okay, you have a catechist, you have a liturgist, so that's a complementary. Everybody brings their own gifts into it, okay? And so I just have to trust that the liturgist, in fact, knows what he or she is doing, okay? I have to believe that, in fact, the sponsors are committed to the work that they're doing. Right? That's that sense of complementary. And then the second kind is overlapping. And that, for example, would be the catechists. When the catechists meet, they all do the same thing. They're all overlapping in their skills and abilities, etc. But they each bring a particular expertise to it. Okay, complementary and overlapping. But the bottom line is that the mutuality of this mutual engagement is rooted in an understanding of the competencies of the various members of the group. And then the second point was engagement shaped by these two. Okay? And the third point is that maintaining the group is an important part of any community. In other words, the person that remembers the birthdays, that brings in the cake and coffee for the morning meeting, that kind of remembers whose granddaughter is doing what, okay? That person is also makes an important contribution to this community of practice and really sets up an environment where that mutual engagement is possible, okay? That mutual engagement, that makes sense? Okay, good, right. The next one then is that it's a shared enterprise. Okay. Firstly, the community itself defines the enterprise. Now, I want to back up and say, we never define an enterprise by ourselves. So the RCIA team, for example, doesn't get to decide what its enterprise is. At some level, that's defined. They have a job. They're supposed to be, in fact, about the task of initiating people into the Christian community. Okay, but what that looks like is shaped and determined in a particular context. So that, and those of you who've been in more than one parish know that the difference between RCIA team at St. Odo the Good and the RCIA team at St. Odo in the Woods is really different. Okay, and that it really does present two different approaches to the same reality, to the same basic task. But how the enterprise is done, okay, is going to be dependent on the group. Secondly, the nature and the direction of the enterprise becomes clear in the doing. And I know you know this, where you have an idea of how something's going to be, and you launch into this program, and about halfway through you begin to realize this isn't working the way it's going, and I need to redirect it. Okay, that's what I mean. All right. That the way in which it takes shape depends on the interchange of the members involved. So, for example, within the RCIA, if we're using that as the example, it's very much the questions and concerns of the people who are participating who are going to be setting the tone and the questions and the direction for what happens in the RCIA. That's how that works. So that they very much form the direction which it's going. And because of that, this leads to shared commitment and accountability. Because I've had a role in this community of practice, because I've been part of the process by which we define the enterprise and give shape to it, that means then that I have more of a sense of commitment to it and more of a sense of accountability. And we can all think of groups that we've been in that I would say we would not use the term community of practice about. Because in fact, you know, if you're in a group where you don't feel any responsibility or any accountability or any role in defining things, it's not a community of practice. Okay? I mean, that's, to me anyway, my sense is that that's a good litmus test of whether it's a community of practice. If you feel some responsibility, then community of practice might be an appropriate way to think about it. Okay? Shared enterprise. And the final one is the common repertoire. The repertoire of a community of practice includes routines, words, tools, ways of doing things, stories, gestures, symbols, genres, actions, or concepts that the community has produced or adopted in the course of its existence and which have become part of its practice. So when we talk about this repertoire, we're talking about the way in which the group is. In other words, the things that a group does aren't just things it does, it's what makes it what it is. This goes back to the point I made earlier, that a community doesn't exist in theory, it exists in the doing. Okay? I know you've been in groups that like talk a lot about being a group. You know, after a while you just go nuts, you know? Or even worse, a relationship where all you talk about is the relationship. Ooh, not a good sign. And what this is saying, that we are engaging in practices, okay, that are designed to further the group and enhance the group's goals. Okay? Common repertoire. You getting in your imagination a community practice that you belong to? Okay, getting a sense of this? Okay, let me give you 2 examples. The first one is Chris's Coffees. Chris is a liturgist that I know, and this group has been going on for quite some time. And he's a layman in a time, and he's been a liturgist. He was a liturgist for about 20 years, in a time when it was very unusual for to have a lay person as a liturgist in a parish. But in that small, this is in the Midwest, and in that small Midwest area, there were several, in fact, there were 4 or 5 liturgists who were all lay people who served as liturgists in their parishes. And so they would meet bi-weekly with regular participation from most members. Okay, that's that mutual engagement. They got together at Perkins Coffee Place, you know, the second Tuesday of every whatever, and they met for conversation. They felt responsible to be there. They felt ownership for the group. It wasn't like if Chris couldn't make it, it didn't happen. Do you know what I mean? The difference? Okay, the community itself was responsible for it. Okay. They had a commitment there to parish, to their parishes, to their work as liturgists, and to one another. So their shared enterprise was to support one another as liturgists. Okay, how did that get played out? That got played out in their commitments to their parishes, to their work, and to one another. Okay, the enterprise was supporting one another as liturgists. And then, so what happened? They began with a check-in. They discussed upcoming challenges. They talked about recent documents or pertinent books, and they laughed a lot. Okay, so that there was a way in which that group that met, those were the activities that it did, and it did them in service to that. Okay, are everybody getting this? Okay, I don't want to belabor it if we're, okay. All right, I'm going to give you one more quick example then. Fore is, this is a group that I belong to, and the reason I'm using this one is because it's an online group. Okay, because I think we can have online communities of practice. And this is the Families of Russian and Ukrainian Adoption, Fore. Both of my daughters were adopted from Russia. And so this is a listserv that was designed to be supportive of families with Russian and Ukrainian adoptions. So there's various levels of engagements because it's a listserv, right? So you have various levels of engagement with a core group playing a major role. So if I was to talk about that community, I would say the community of practice was the core group. Do you know what I mean? In other words, it'd be hard to say the whole, there were hundreds of people on that listserv, many of whom just kind of just read the postings. Hard to say, you know, yeah, I suppose you could think of them as being at the margins, but many of them seldom posted or didn't post at all, or so their role in defining the enterprise was minimal. Okay, and that would be a good test for where membership is. Okay, So the very level engagement, there were lots, as I say, lots of folks at the periphery. So the enterprise was to support the Russian and Ukrainian adoptions in general by supporting families who were engaging in the process and families who had come home with their children. So it was committed to further Russian and Ukrainian adoptions, to supporting families. And now, okay, that's the enterprise. Here's an example of something that was really interesting. Because this is communities of practice don't always work as, like, we don't always get along, as you may know from your own experience in communities of practice. The question was, when many of us got home with our sons or daughters, there were more challenges, I think, than we had read about in the books, you know. And for some people, there were significant challenges, okay, with significant developmental delays and then significant other emotional and psychological problems. So the question is, do you talk about those? Okay. For some, who we all had this enterprise of supporting Russian and Ukrainian adoption, for some, to talk about it was to discourage people from adopting. Okay? For others, myself included, was no point having them adopt if they're going to have to terminate the adoption. Do you know what I mean? You know, so what are we supporting here? We're supporting Russian and Ukrainian adoptions. But that means speaking reality of what that's about. But so the enterprise, while the enterprise was agreed upon, the way the enterprise was approached, okay, that in fact there were debates about it. And so that in that sense, the enterprise was being redefined by the group. Okay, we came to a new understanding, new definition, and it changed as the group changed. So as those of us who were in some of the early adoptions, as our children got older, in fact, we ended up forming another group. Just we had so many different issues. Okay. So what do? We tell stories, we offer advice, we recount our own experiences, we exchange information, discuss resources, make suggestions, connect offline rather, send pictures, and then we organized an annual get-together, usually about once a year we would get together. So those are the things we did to accomplish the enterprise and foster this sense of mutual engagement. All right? Okay. So let's think about, we're going to talk about, think about a community of practice that you're a practitioner, you're a participant in now. In what way are those categories helpful categories? How are they helpful for how you think more carefully about the group and your participation in it? Okay, community of practice. Do you have one in your mind? Okay. Why don't you just talk to the person next to you for 4.5 minutes? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, 5. About your experience of community of practice. What's that about for you? The next two pieces are in fact, the part that's the first one is really a review of kind of other people's ideas. The next two are the ones I've been spending most time playing with over the past several weeks. It's been fun. Examine the potential of thinking about each parish as a community of communities, which is what we're talking about. And then thirdly, draw out the implications of this as we think about adult faith formation. And here what I want to look at is say, what does this mean the role of the religious educator is in this context? Okay, that's what I want to be looking at. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about this notion of the parish as a community of communities. Let me just get to my notes. Okay. And there's three points I want to make here. 3 tends to be my magic number, so there's 3 points. Okay. One is thinking of the parish as a community of communities allows us to recognize and build on the communities of practice that are already present in our ecclesial settings. So that one thing is simply to raise to our consciousness both the formal, and I like that, John, the informal communities of practice that are part of our ecclesial setting. Secondly, it gives us a way to think about membership, identity, and the way we welcome new members. See, I think that if we think about the communities of practice as being one of the places where we welcome new members in, what does that mean for what our communities of practice look like? And then thirdly, it provides a lens for thinking about the particular role of religious educators in faith formation that is lifelong and parish-wide. So I want to talk about these and then move on. The first one is, I wish we could figure out how to stop saying the parish is a community. It's not. I mean, yes, parish community, I get, you know, and certainly there's a whole theological framework of communio that we would make reference to when we talk about the notion of parish. But most of our parishes, there are some exceptions, clearly, most of our parishes are too large to be anything close to what we would think of in common parlance as a community. And so that's one of the reasons why I think speaking of it as a community of communities is an important first step, to begin to recognize that people don't, in fact, people join the parish, but if they're really going to be parts of the parish, they do it through a community of practice. They don't do it through the parish at large. They may go to Mass every Sunday, okay, but they're not engaged in the parish in the way we're talking about it here. Okay. The second one, and this gets back to some of the points that we've been mentioning already, okay. Well, no, I'm sorry, let me continue. Similar kind of thing. We become aware of the communities that shape our parish, the school or religious communities, whatever context you're thinking about. And again, being able to name the formal and informal ones. Sorry. Third one is that it highlights the dynamic of the interconnection among communities within the one community. This is a piece that I want to just talk about a little bit, because I think it's a serious concern, and it touches on a number of issues that have been raised already. Okay, if we think about often how we think about parish communities, and this gets back to the point, what was your name? Leo. This gets to the point that Leo was making. What we often have are simply big groups, okay? So we have, let me change my color here. So we have, this is the RCIA, okay? This is the musicians, I-C-I-A-N-S, that's musicians, okay? Then we also have the catechists, okay? So we have all those groups, okay? And what has happened in most of our parishes, as we know, is we've formed these into silos, so that they're often unconnected, not interacting groups. And that's not, and when you talk about communities of practice, the fear is, or it could look like that's what we're proposing, is we end up with maintaining these silos. And that's one of the things and that's why I want to emphasize that notion of community of communities. So that, in fact, the parish community itself has an enterprise. And that each of these then, in some way, kind of become the things that mutually engage. They almost become people. I don't know how to say it. They each become kind of units that engage with the parish community's enterprise of evangelization. Is that clear? Because otherwise we end up maintaining the process as it is right now, which is a separate understanding into separate silos. So another way to think about this is to think about it, let me just see think about it as a dock, okay? So instead of thinking of them as individual little circles, as you can see, this is a new toy and I love it. And I really will get good at it. Again, it's just, you're the first group to really use it fully here. Okay, so that each of these planks then is a community of practice. Okay, so we have the RCIA, okay, we have the catechists, we have the musicians. I'll never leave them off again. Okay, so those are each planks in the process by which we live out what it means to be a community of faith. Okay, so that the dock itself is the community of communities, and these are communities that are in service to it. So that there is, in fact, a mutual relationship among them. Okay, this is all in service to that one issue of how do we talk about the dynamics of the interconnection of these communities, and how does that image help us to think about it different from the kind of individual circles that we often use to describe just flow chart kind of thing. This is kind of a different model for it. Does that make some sense? This is a way to think about it? Okay. Okay. Come on. All right. Next one is, communities of practice are serve as a point of entry into the parish. I think this is a really important point for us to think about, because I think it really does give us a way to name the interaction of what happens in the role of a community of communities. And here's an example. But you know what? Let me go on, because in fact that's really what the next whole heading is about. Okay, the next whole heading is about membership and identity and welcoming new members. And that's the second point. Is it gives us a way. This is the second helpful point about why using communities of practice to examine our parishes might be helpful. And the second one is that it gives us a way to think about membership, identity, and the way we welcome new members. Okay. The first one is that notion that mutual engagement requires being included in what matters for the community. This gets back to the question of the parish council and whether or not the parish council is really involved in what matters for the parish, for the community, in the sense of, are they really responsible for what happens and what is engaged with that. So it's a process of, part of what has to happen, particularly in the context of adult faith formation, I believe, is a process of empowering. Okay, the example that I give, which is a good one, I think, is if I went to the gym every day, which obviously I don't, but if I went to the gym every day, okay, and if I had a trainer, okay, the trainer would tell me you do this because it does this muscles and that muscles and that muscles, and you do this because it does this and that, and you do this for this long, and do this with this many and this much weight and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and I do it. Okay, what if one day I come in and my trainer says, why don't you rearrange the equipment in a way that best suits your own understanding of your physiology? I would, what? Right? And he could say to me, or she could say to me, in all honesty, you have all the information. Yeah, but I don't do it. And I think that happens in our parish community sometimes. That we give the information. We say to somebody, well, you know everything about the liturgy, you know the information. You're on the parish council, why aren't you making decisions? Okay, so I don't know what the miss is all the time, but what I do know is that somehow we need to make that shift from being simply, having people in our parish be simply recipients of the information. And to some extent, if I go back to the gym analogy, it would seem to me that part of the problem is that perhaps the trainer was too often making decisions for me as soon as I hesitated. So instead of letting me decide for myself in some cases and then begin to put it together, the trainer was always telling me what to do. And so I think that there's anyway, I don't have any big answer on that one, but I just think that is an issue. Second point is communities of practice serve as a context for renewing membership and reformulating identity as Christians. Quick example. I have some friends who are in their early 70s now, late 60s, early 70s. And, they were part of the parish, big with their kids. They had 3 kids, so they were really involved. They did everything from, take pictures at First Communion to chaperoning the, youth dances. They were just right there, not obtrusively to their kids, but just kind of, they were really engaged, and they taught religious ed, and they were involved in commissions and committees and on parish councils, etc. And then their kids finished and left and gone, and they had no way to go. There was no, they were going to Mass on Sunday, but it's like they didn't feel any connection. Okay, so to some extent what happened was they belonged to communities of practice through the affiliation with their children, and now, where's the community of practice they belong to next? And they'd be the first one to tell you they're not joiners. They didn't think being a catechist or being engaged in parish council was being joiners. That's working, that's got, And that was very much kind of their stance until Katrina. And the parish had a group that met, if you want to do something, if you want to help out something with Katrina, come to the parish. And Bob, the guy, saw it and said, yeah, let's go. Okay? And that totally changed their relationship with the wider community of communities. Because they, in fact, they went down and were building houses, you know, with the parish. So when they came back, they now had that connection with the parish community that was part of a community of communities. So you see how helping people to affiliate with different community of communities along the way can in fact nurture them in their faith at various points. Okay, so they really were able to take on a whole new identity at some level within that parish community. Next one. New members are welcomed into the community through the communities of practice. And here the example I think is really good is 12-step programs. Okay, anybody involved in a 12-step program, let's say AA for example, will tell you you don't get sober belonging to AA. You get sober belonging to a group. You know, it's your affiliation with a group, with a specific group to whom you're accountable. That's how people in AA get sober. Okay, and so that while someone in the program might say that they belong to AA, they don't. I mean, they do, but it's because of their connection with that specific community of practice. Okay, and actually, in literature on communities of practice, 12-step programs, AA in particular, is often used as a good example of communities of practice. That's and kind of the notion, although they wouldn't use the term of communities of practice. So, again, one of the helpful points to think about as we're thinking about how this concept of communities of practice is helpful is to say, how are people welcomed into our parish communities? And what role does affiliation with these smaller communities serve in that? And how do we enhance that? Okay? Because really what we're doing when we talk about participating in these communities, we're really talking about is that the communities, these are communities that practice the practices that define who and whose we are. So that at some level, that's how we are shaped and formed, is by hanging out in these communities that do this. Third point. Remember here, what are we doing here? We're saying, how is this helpful to speak of communities of practice? How is that a helpful category? Okay, it gives us a way to think about the communities within our parishes. It gives us a way to think about membership, and finally, I think it gives us a way to think about the role of the religious educator. Okay, 2 points that I couldn't do anything else other than just write them out. Because if we understand faith formation as being rooted within a community of communities of practice, then it is not the sole domain or responsibility of the designated religious educator or even the pastoral staff. One of the things that people will tell you who are part of 12-step groups, they'll tell you, is that they're responsible for welcoming the new person. Nobody's in charge of welcoming the new person. If you're at a meeting and you see somebody who's new, you're responsible for welcoming them. That's your job, simply by being a member. Okay? So that we're all practitioners within the communities of practice. Therefore, our lives give evidence of what it means to be a practitioner of Christianity, to be a Christian. So that it totally shifts the emphasis from the role of the religious educator to the role of the community. All right? And to the degree to which this community of practice, these communities of practice are vibrant and alive, they do this to a greater or lesser extent. So in light of that, though, what is the role of the educator? And I want to propose 3, amazingly enough. A, they bring into focus, these I just made these up, so, you know, I mean, like over the past week, so I'm open to suggestions, okay? But I think one of the things they do is they bring into focus the practices that are to permeate all Christian communities of practice. In other words, are there some underlying principles, underlying practices, underlying repertoire of activities that need to be there present in all of them? Okay, and just for the sake of this conversation, I'm thinking, for example, hospitality, sustained conversation, and service. That's just 3. I mean, there are obviously others. But that every community of practice has to have these embodied in their activities. Okay, that's the first thing. And I think the religious educator plays a role in bringing this to our awareness. Not in providing hospitality, all conversations there, but in bringing it to awareness for all the communities of practice. Okay, that's the first one. Second one, I think the educator needs to be intentional about those activities that enhance the practice of particular groups of believers. So, for example, how do children come to know the story and vision that shape Christian practice? Okay, that has to happen. And that's the role of the educator to raise those questions and to be sure that that gets done. What issues shape the parents of young children as they attempt to give meaning to the promises made at baptism? How can the stories and practice that have shaped Christians in the past be brought forward for the contemporary setting? So those are the questions that whenever anybody gathers, the religious educator's thinking about how does this group engage with the story, engage with the tradition, translate it for today. All right? That's the role of the religious educator. Okay? See? This one, I know it's true, but I don't have very much to say about it other than it. This is true. Okay? Provide opportunity for critical reflection on our practice. To ask what it means here and now to practice being a Christian. Here's my concern with communities of practice. As with any model of formation that relies at some level on a socialization model, okay, some level at socializing people into a way of being and doing, is we need to be really conscious of where's the critical edge, where's the prophetic voice, where are the people that say, yeah, you think it's okay that that's what the community practice does, but in fact, that's not reflective of the gospel. Okay, to some extent, that's at some level dealt with the first one, bring it to focus the practices that are to permeate all communities of practice. But I think it has its own category. I think there's something about that, but I haven't done anything more with that. So if anybody has any great ideas, we can talk about that after. But I think that is an important piece. And then the final one, be particularly aware of newcomers. And here, I'm just drawing on the General Directory for Catechesis that talks about the way in which we engage in evangelization. And in that context, it says that we evangelize those who've never heard the gospel. We evangelize children and youth within believing families and communities. And we evangelize those for whom the gospel is external to their lives. Let me just read that section if you haven't heard it before. It's in... anybody who knows me is not surprised that we're reading a document in the end, okay? General Directory for Catechesis, paragraph 58C. It's talking about, in many countries of established Christian tradition, and sometimes in younger churches, there exists an intermediate situation where entire groups of baptized have lost a living sense of the faith, or even no longer consider themselves members of the church and live a life far removed from Christ and his gospel. Such situations require a new evangelization. The peculiar nature of the situation is found in the fact that missionary activity is directed towards the baptized of all ages who live in a religious context in which Christian points of reference are perceived purely exteriorly. Here, primary proclamation and basic catechesis are priorities. See, and I think much of what we're talking about, like the members who are not members kind of thing, that's who we're talking about. We're talking about people for whom having their child baptized is not unlike getting the 6-month shots. It's just what you do next. You know, I mean, of course I'm going to have my child baptized. Or who are present at First Communion and at reconciliation, having their children receive those sacraments when they never received the sacrament themselves. Sometimes either sacrament, but certainly not reconciliation. Do you know what I mean? So it's like somehow that has become external to them. And so the religious educator needs to be aware of how the communities of practice are welcoming all three groups. So, back to my opening thesis. A helpful way to look at the formative dynamics of parish or congregations is to examine it through the lens of communities of practice. And increasing awareness of ourselves as active participants in Christian communities of practice enhances our ability to fulfill our mission, the Church's mission, of evangelization. I think that's true. I hope you kind of are getting a sense that it could be true too. And then the most important question, so what?